So I want to pick up where we left off last week and talk about the extended common currency schema here, or this theory that suggests that there's a particular valuation system that involves the ventral striatum and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and other regions like this, which we might refer to as the valuation system or the reward system. And the theory goes or suggests that this system is involved in evaluating outcomes of our decisions across all sorts of different contexts. They include non-social contexts, so they might include decisions that are risky in nature, decisions that play out over time, so intertemporal choice, or decisions that involve different types of attributes. So that's the idea of comparing apples to oranges, or holiday investments to investments into houses or cars. So choice scenarios where decision attributes can differ quite a bit and that are relatively abstract and therefore quite difficult to make. The suggestion here is that this doesn't play out only in non-social contexts, but also in social contexts. And this is what Fair and Roof proposed in their 2014 paper. And so the question then arises, well, then there must be some regions that seem to be specifically involved in processing these types of social contexts, social scenarios, such as the history I've had with an interaction partner. If it was a good history, then it might want to enhance the utility or the value that we estimate for the other person's outcomes. So we might be thinking of decisions that are beneficial to this other person. So we don't only just consider our outcomes, we also consider the outcomes of an interaction partner as they increase also our utility of the decisions. They might also have been negative in the past, and so we want to be more selfish in those kinds of situations. But there should be a set of regions that can encode this, that can encode the social context I'm in. Is it a competitive one or is it an interactive one? And thereby influence in a top-down way the valuation that we conduct, that the valuation system computes in a top-down sort of way. The question arises then, what are these areas and what possible social cognitive processes might they be involved in? And there's this wonderful review that gives us an initial suggestion of what areas to look at by Rilling and Sanfi in 2011. And while a qualitative summary of the literature, not a meta-analysis in this sense, it suggests a number of regions that are very interesting, and they include the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and we'll talk about this region in the near future, which has been shown to be involved in learning about others' trustworthiness and strategizing in different social contexts. Another interesting region is the anterior cingulate cortex, but let's look at the lateral view of this, where we have, for instance, the temporoparietal junction, also involved in trustworthiness learning, and the superior temporal sulcus, which we have met before as part of the sort of social visual system, which also has a posterior part that's very important in the social context. And so you might call these regions social cognitive regions because they're involved in sort of specifically social processes that require specific cognitive abilities, such as, well, putting yourself into the shoes of another person, simulating what another person might feel like in a certain context or given the facial expression that they're exhibiting, but also simulating their actions and what the intentions of their actions are. And so this brings us to three topics that have been studied in social neuroscience that involve theory of mind, mirror neurons, and empathy. Let's then have a quick definition of what these three terms mean. Now, the ability to understand someone else's mental state is commonly referred to as theory of mind, or the ability to mentalize, that's another word for it. And it's basically our ability to estimate someone else's beliefs, someone else's intentions and desires, based on the context that these people are in, via simulating how we would feel, how we would act, and what our intentions would be in a similar situation. Similarly, to understand others' motor intentions, so what are their movements, we actually have a set of neurons, specialized in a sense, neurons. Those are visual motor neurons in our motor system that allow us to simulate other people's actions. And finally, we have the ability to share someone else's feeling or simulate other people's emotional and affective states by using empathy. And those are relatively rough definitions. And these are abilities that have been shown to rely on somewhat distinct and somewhat overlapping as well neural circuits. Let's first discuss theory of mind. And this was defined by Premack and Woodruff in 1978 already as the ability to perceive and communicate mental states such as intentions, beliefs, and desires. And obviously, this is in other people, right? Frith and Frith have called it the ability to mentalize, which is basically saying that we're able to infer other people's mental states based on a number of factors, right? And I'll give you one of the tests, show you one of the tests that is commonly used in this kind of literature in a second. So this is called the false belief task. And from the age of 4, children are actually able to do this. There's a clear neural network, which we'll discuss in a second, that's involved in theory of mind. And you can look this up on Neurosynth. There's a map for this. You can enter the search term theory of mind or mentalizing, and you'll find that the regions involved are the TPJ bilaterally, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the superior temporal sulcus. So let's have a look real quick at the Sally-Ann task. This is now a bit of an older task. The figure here is from the review by Ralph Adolphs in Nature Reviews Neuroscience from 2003. This is commonly used to investigate theory of mind. And it's a very simple task because researchers use it in children. And again, what we typically find is that this ability starts at about the age of 4, with some variability around this, obviously. And for instance, that patients with ASD, so autistic spectrum disorder, have some problems with these types of tasks. So let's have a quick look at this task. It's very simple. So we have 2 children. This one is called Sally, one is called Anne. Sally has a basket and Anne has a box. And Sally has a marble, and she puts the marble into her basket. But then she goes out for a walk. She walks away for a little bit, and Anne is left alone. Anne then takes the marble out of the basket and puts it into her box. When Sally comes back from her walk, she basically wants to go get her marble again. And then the question to the children, or whoever takes this task, is where will Sally look for the marble? And a child below the age of 4 will say, well, in the box, because that's where the marble is, right? But that doesn't take into account Sally's mental state, because Sally walked away and she doesn't know that Anne transferred the marble from the basket to the box. Given this lack of knowledge, Sally should look for the marble, obviously, in the basket. So that's a simple mistake that younger children make. They cannot infer basically from their own mental states, from their knowledge, to what kind of knowledge another person that may not have witnessed a certain event may or may not have. So it's a simple task, and this obviously has been extended to the neuroimaging context, and this is work by Rebecca Sachs. Here, she has many papers on this, but this is one example from her 2006 paper from Psych Science. So what's commonly done here is participants lie in the scanner and they read these kinds of stories, or vignettes they're called, and some stories are just about the appearance of a person and others about the thoughts that these people have, the protagonists in the story. So this obviously means that, for instance, for appearance and bodily sensations, you do not have to make any inferences about their mental states, whereas in the final category of vignettes, participants have to make an inference about the mental states that the protagonists of the story are in. So let's have a quick look at this one here. So this is just a control condition about appearance. Joe was a heavy-set man with a gut that fell over his belt. He was balding and combed his blonde hair over the top of his head. His face was pleasant with large brown eyes. So this is a control condition. no theory of mind, no mentalizing is necessary here to fully understand this story. Then on the other side, we have Nicky knew that his sister's flight from San Francisco was delayed 10 hours. Only one flight was delayed so much that night. So when he got to the airport, he knew that flight was hers. So this is clearly a story about the mental state, the understanding that Nicky has about his sister's flight from San Francisco. And you have to sort of imagine these kinds of mental computations that Nicky goes through. Similarly here, Rob tied his dog's leash to a lamppost while he went into a store to buy coffee. When he came out, his dog had run across the street. He guessed that the leash had come untied. So this is a belief, right, that we're talking about here. So we have two beliefs and sort of two non-belief type of stories. And then we can look at, well, what are the neural correlates when participants are reading and understanding these types of stories. And here's a network that's commonly found in these experiments and which has been replicated now across a large number of studies. And what we see here is that when stories or these vignettes involve thoughts about, when they involve thoughts by other people, we see that there's a network that's commonly activated. So you can see there's a larger activation during these sort of theory of mind type stories relative to the other two categories of stories, such that the TPJ bilaterally shows increased activity. And then finally, the posterior cingulate cortex that shows a similar increased activation during theory of mind type stories or stories involving thoughts relative to the other two types of stories. Now, again, as I said, this has been replicated a number of times and led to the suggestion that these purple regions here are particularly or specifically, at least consistently, involved in theory of mind. So that's the medial prefrontal cortex, that's the TPJ, the superior temporal sulcus, and the temporal pole. And here is a meta-analysis that I took from Neurosynth showing these same type of regions for theory of mind. So again, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, temporal-parietal junction. And this is the posterior cingulate cortex as well. So these are the types of regions involved in theory of mind, and there's quite some consistency that this network is involved in this particular kind of social cognition. Let us now talk about mirror neurons. Now, this is an interesting story where researchers were performing or conducting these experiments on motor neurons in a region, namely area F5 of the motor cortex. Well, it's actually part of the premotor cortex, and this is a monkey brain that's shown here, right? So area 5 is about here, and these were electrophysiological studies, which you know well about now. So involving the implantation of an electrode into neurons, into motor neurons within this cortical area. These studies were performed by Gallese and Risolati in about 1996. And the original origin or the goal of the study was to understand better the involvement of these neurons in action, in planning and performing actions, right? So in this case, it was involved in hand movements. The monkey was asked to do a number of hand movements, for instance, to pick up some food reward from a platter, such as shown here, right? And then you can see that there's an increased responding when the monkey initiates the movement. The interesting thing, though, was that what the researchers left the apparatus on one day while they were setting up the experiment. And as you may know from previous lectures, you can actually hear the action potentials as these popping sounds that the apparatus produces. So the amplifier that is involved in recording the action potentials from the neurons. And what the researchers realized is that whenever they were performing a similar movement, so when the monkey was not making the movement, but the experimenter was placing the food item on the food tray or on the platter, then these same neurons would also show increased firing rates. And that's what's exactly shown here, right? So there seems to be a visual aspect of these motor neurons that is involved in understanding or interpreting the actions of other people, of other types of not the monkeys, but in this case the experimenters' hand movements. You can see there's a bit of a lower responsiveness to this relative to when the monkey performs an action, him or herself, but there's a clear increase in responding within these types of neurons. Now, similar mechanisms were then found later on in the human brain, for instance, from this study by Milner and colleagues, conducted in 2009, where you have two tasks. So one task is to execute a motor action in the scanner, and they make some kind of hand movement in the scanner. The other task is to observe, let's say in a video, for instance, other people making similar hand movements. You can see that the same kind of areas activate to this, and these both are in premotor cortex, so homologous in many ways to this area F5 shown here in the monkey brain. So there's converging evidence from two different species and two different imaging modalities or neuroscientific modalities, implicating these same regions in both of these aspects. A clear and large response, also shown here, when participants are asked to execute a hand movement, and a somewhat reduced response, but still clear and significant, when that same movement is observed by the participant. Now, this was interesting, obviously because, well, it might explain how we understand other people's actions. If the same neurons that are involved in planning our actions are involved in or fire when other people are performing similar actions, then this indicates that what we might be doing to understand others' actions, and thereby their intentions, right? So actions towards me could be hostile, but they could also be embracing in a sense. So it's important that we are able to simulate other people's movements to make sense of them. Are they hostile? Are they friendly? Those kinds of interpretations can be very important because they actually could lead to survival, right? Or could further our survival and inform our future actions. So these findings suggest that these types of motor neurons are able to simulate other people's actions and thereby help us understand what their intentions are. Now, there's 4 properties that are important for these mirror neurons. Now, the first thing is they fire during observation of specific actions, and that means that they have that they're part of partially visual neurons. So there's activation from visual input that drives these neurons. They're also, since they're part of premotor cortex, clearly involved in planning and performing motor commands, right? So actions. So they fire during observation of specific actions, but they also fire during the performance of the same action. They don't fire during tool use. That's what's shown here. So when the same action is performed with an extension, with a tool, then there's no activation of these neurons, because then it's possibly a bit more removed, a bit more abstract in terms of what occurs in terms of the simulation, right? And finally, they are clearly motor neurons because they fire during action in darkness. So when you take out all the visual inputs, so it's not just observing my own hand that drives these neurons, but simply the action. So we have an observational component and we have an action component here, making these clearly visual motor neurons and mirror neurons that allow us to, again, simulate other people's actions and thereby understand them better. Now, there's some link between these mirror neurons and possibly the development of theory of mind. And this is a really interesting study that was done in the 70s by Melzoff and Moore. It's a famous study published in Science way back when. And what you can see is that infants between the ages of 12 and 21 days, so very, very young infants, can already imitate facial and manual gestures. So when you stick out the tongue at an infant, the infant will respond by sticking out his or her tongue. When you open your mouth like this, the infant will respond in a very similar way. And this is true for other types of facial and manual gestures. So this is very interesting. So this imitation could in fact be a starting point, and might and has to be at some level a reflection of these types of visual motor neurons, this translation between visual input and producing the same movements as what I'm perceiving here. This link between the visual and the motor system is already established at such a young age, and clearly motor neurons or these mirror neurons are at work here to enable these kinds of actually relatively complex behaviors at such a young age. And one suggestion here is, and that's a very interesting suggestion, I think, is that this kind of imitation may in fact be a starting point for the development of theory of mind, right? It's initiating these kinds of similar movements. If I can do this quite well for these kinds of simple things, then we can easily imagine that as this child develops, these copy mechanisms, in a sense, can just simply be simulated. You don't need to actually behave like the other person after some time. You can simply think, okay, that's what the person is doing, and this is the situation when I last did this in. Therefore, this other person is probably feeling or thinking as I did in this situation. So it's a starting point for the development of theory of mind, in a sense. And in fact, there's some evidence supporting this, as a more recent study found that impairments in this early ability can be an early sign of autism spectrum disorder. So if you already at a young developmental age, such as this, can pick up that an infant is, for instance, not able to do this kind of behaviors very well, and that's then associated later on with the onset of ASD, for instance, this would be very helpful to start intervening at a very early age and train these kinds of behaviors. But you can see that there's a clear link between this very simple imitation at a very early age, the mirror neuron system, and then much more complex simulations at a later age that allow us to understand other people's intentions and predict their behaviors, in a sense. Let's now move to the final social, cognitive, and affective skill that humans have, and that can serve as an input into the valuation system and can also potentially affect our utility functions in the context of social interactions, namely empathy. And empathy is defined as the human ability to identify what someone else is thinking or feeling and to respond to their thoughts and feelings with an appropriate emotion. This is a definition from Baron Cohen in 2012. And it's commonly distanced from theory of mind, which is understanding the cognitive intentions of another person. So that's a clearly social cognitive ability, whereas empathy is an affective ability. So that also drives pro-social motivation. Right? So empathy is seen as one of the drivers of our ability or our willingness to help others when they're in need or when they're in pain, when they're suffering. And this is represented in the empathy altruism hypothesis by Batson. So Batson actually, he has a kind of interesting research story. He set out to prove that everything that we do, including altruistic acts, are actually driven by our own selfish needs. I mean, you could make the argument that helping another person is done for selfish motives because it makes us feel good to help another person, or when the other person is suffering a lot, then we want to relieve our own pain that we're observing, that is caused by simply observing this other person in pain. So those would be selfish motives. But as he progressed in his career, and as he conducted studies on human nature, especially on empathy, he came to the conclusion that really the main driver of altruistic behavior is empathy. So our ability to put ourselves emotionally into the other state of another person. And empathy really, that's his conclusion from many years, probably over 30 years of research on exactly this topic, trying to prove the opposite, trying to prove that all of our actions are actually motivated by selfish motives. He concluded that empathy actually is the motivating factor for altruistic behavior. and not some form of egoism. Now, this is also, obviously, this is an important topic, so it's been picked up by social neuroscience and social neuroeconomics, studying basically how the brain responses to observing other people in pain occur and develop across a study. And the regions involved here are the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. And there's this very famous study here that I'd like to discuss briefly, and which in a sense started this entire research on empathy. This is a study by Tanya Singer and colleagues, published in 2004. And what they did is they asked participants to bring along a loved one, so a partner. And then they put the participants in the scanner and hooked them up to to electrodes that then delivered electric shocks to their hands. While they were sitting in the scanner, their partner was sitting next to them, or their loved one in any case, and was also receiving electrical shocks. So then you can imagine having a screen in front of you with an arrow pointing down to you and an arrow pointing to the left or to the right where your partner is sitting, indicating who is receiving an electrical shock and at what time throughout the experiment, right? So it's quite a simple experiment in that sense, with specific time points in which you as the participant were receiving shocks and your partner also was receiving shocks, and you knew what was happening because it was indicated to you via these arrows. And you can also vary the intensity, for instance, of these shocks. So with, for instance, like a little slider next to the arrow indicating how intense and how bad the electric shock was to yourself and also to your partner. And then what Singer and colleagues did is they looked at the neural correlates, reflecting basically activation to when you were receiving a shock and activation when a partner was receiving a shock. And this is the results at the imaging level here. The contrast basically is pain versus no pain. And in green, you see when this occurred to yourself. So when you received a painful shock relative to when you received a non-painful shock. And for the other, the same occurred with a painful relative to a non-painful shock being received at that time point for your partner, but not for yourself. So you were just seeing an arrow pointing to your partner. That's all you were seeing at this point if you would have been a participant in this study. You can see that what's actually called the pain matrix is activated during receiving shocks yourself. So you have the left insula, which is part of the secondary somatosensory cortex, the posterior insula here, and we have, this is still part of the posterior insula, but then extending into anterior insula here, right? And also the anterior cingulate cortex also showing activation. So this is a part of what may be called the pain matrix, regions that are obviously involved in processing the incoming stimulus, such as somatosensory cortex here in the insula, but also regions that are involved in interpreting how bad the stimulus is. Is it the valence aspect, basically, right? Is it good or bad for you? And that's something that the anterior cingulate does, but it's also something that the anterior insula does. Basically adding the affective component to the stimulus that's incoming. One part is entirely non-affective. What is the stimulus? Where is it on my body? And the other part is affective. Is it good or bad for me? And you can see that particularly in these affective regions, the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, there's quite some overlap, right? Between when you're receiving it versus when the other person is receiving it, so your partner, person that you care about. So this overlap then suggests that, like the mirror neurons in a sense, right, that understanding another person's being in pain also involves the similar regions that are involved in effectively interpreting the incoming signal from your somatosensory cortex. So the types of signals that, or the types of regions that would receive signals from the pain receptors in the skin. So this kind of makes a lot of sense. So this is also a simulation account then, or this could be interpreted as to have empathy. We need to engage these kinds of regions that usually interpret whether we are in pain, whether we are receiving some negative stimulus that we should withdraw from. That is also engaged when we see other people in pain, So I think this makes a lot of sense, especially after having discussed the mirror neurons, that similar regions are involved in interpreting our pain and interpreting other people's pain. There's more evidence for this that is quite kind of interesting. So this actually can be up or down regulated. One of the pieces of evidence is that psychopaths, for instance, they can empathize with other people. Obviously, they have the same brains, they have these same types of networks, but they simply choose not to. So they regulate the empathy. But if they're asked to, and if they're motivated to, if you pay them for it, for instance, they can turn on the empathy. But it's just not convenient, so you can kind of turn it off. And this is exactly, well, it's similar what's shown here. So this is an interesting study by Gert Hein and colleagues done in 2010 in Zurich, actually. And what they did here is they created an in-group, out-group situation, which is common in social psychology. But they did this really well in this study. So they took, there's two soccer teams in Zurich that are really competitive with each other. And so the Hein and colleagues here took basically hardcore fans from each of the teams and recruited them and asked them to conduct this experiment with them in the scanner. So they would see an in-group member in pain while in the scanner, and they would see an out-group member in pain while in the scanner. And you can see that that the neural response when you see an out-group member in pain is significantly reduced in the anterior insula. So this is the same region that we're seeing here, right? The anterior insula basically encodes this empathy response, interprets how bad the situation is for the person that you're seeing in pain. And there's a significant reduction in this empathic response, this neural empathic response, when seeing an out-group member in pain relative to seeing an in-group member in pain. While the previous study might indicate that we're not empathic to members of out-groups, the good news is that this is actually not set in stone, so we can actually train our ability to empathize even with members from out-groups. And this is what we're showing in a study that we conducted here, also in Switzerland, and together with Gert Hein and Phil Tobler. What we did here is we basically designed an intervention in which the participant in the scanner received help from an out-group member. But let me go through this a bit more slowly. Let's start at the pre-intervention phase. So we had an in-group member that was sitting next to the participant who was in the scanner receiving electric shocks, and then we had again these arrows indicating to the participant who was receiving the shock at what time point. On the left side, let's say there was an in-group member. On the right side, there was an out-group member sitting there. And in our case, in-group and out-group meant having either a Swiss last name that was clearly identifiable and also clearly shown to the participants, or a last name that was associated with being an immigrant from the Balkans, where the Balkan group, Balkan migrants are commonly portrayed as something negative by right-wing parties within Switzerland. So there's somewhat of a stigma about this type of group. Our participants were Swiss, and our confederates, which received these last names and participated, which we introduced into the study as the experimenters, they actually switched the last names from participant to participants. So then what we did here is we had a pre-intervention stage where participants simply received shocks themselves and saw the other two participants receive shocks, right? The in-group member and the putative out-group member. Then we went through an intervention phase, and we had two groups here, an experimental group and a control group, and I'll show this to you in a second how this looked like. And it basically meant that for a number of periods, we received help from either an out-group member or from an in-group member. Then we switched the members, and two new members came into the group in the post-intervention phase. One clear in-group member and one clear out-group member, but a different individual. So let's have a look at how we did this in the scanner. It's basically the same setup that I talked about before. So the arrow is indicating who is receiving a shock. In this case, an out-group member is receiving a shock. Then there's a pain bar, and that's indicating the magnitude of the shock. At some point, there is then actually a shock that is given to the participant. So when this comes onto the screen, then the participant in the scanner knows that now the outgroup member is receiving a shock. If the arrow is pointing to the other side, then an in-group member receives a shock. And at the end, there's a rating asking the participant, well, how bad was this for you, seeing the other person in shock versus receiving a shock yourself? So we get a sort of valence rating of what occurred in this on this current trial. Then, so they go through this with one in-group member, one out-group member. Then what happened next is this intervention, this learning intervention. And on each trial, the participant that was sitting with them, either an in-group member in the control group or an out-group member in the experimental group, was helping the participant in the following way. So the shock was always administered to the participant in the scanner, but there was a decision screen where, let's say, the out-group member in this case was making a decision about whether they want to give up 5 Swiss francs to cancel an electric shock to the person that's lying in the scanner. So they're basically giving up altruistically something from themselves, namely in this case €5, to remove a shock that the participant in the scanner would otherwise be receiving. This is basically showing that the participant, the outgroup member, decided to give up some money to so that the participant in the scanner did not receive a shock. If the box was on the right side, then this would indicate that on that trial, the outgroup member decided not to give up their money to remove the shock from the participant in the scanner. Then there was another rating scale, and then whatever was decided was implemented. Now, what we decided to do is to pre-program this so that we have control about this. And in our case, we decided to have 75% of helping trials and 25% of non-helping trials, so that there was a bit of a surprise that subjects would be kept on their toes. And also to allow us to model this as a reinforcement learning type experiment, right? So we can then, if it's not deterministic but probabilistic, we can see how participants learn throughout this period. Obviously, there was also a control group, which was half of the participants where the potential helper was an in-group member. We're mostly interested, obviously, in the experimental group where the potential helper is an out-group member. What we find is that there is clear activation in the anterior insula that is related to the empathy. Now, at the beginning, and that's what the blue bars show, this is during the pre-intervention phase relative to the post-intervention phase. So during the pre-intervention phase, there was a clear in-group bias. So this is, the bars are representing the response of the anterior insula to the in-group versus the out-group response. So that's basically the difference between these two bars that we saw from the earlier study. So indicating that there is a clear in-group bias in the anterior insula pre-intervention. Now, when we look at the experimental group post-intervention, that's this bar here with the blue lines, then we can see that this bias flips, and that now the empathy response to the out-group is increased, whereas relative to that to the in-group. So we see that our intervention then, this intervention here where participants learn that the out-group member is actually someone who's quite nice to you, changes the neural response. Whereas this did not occur in the control group. In fact, there's a slight increase in the in-group bias when helping was given by an in-group member. So this is basically showing that when empathy, or when someone is nice to you unexpectedly, so you didn't have expectations about this, you're learning about this person for the first time, it's someone you didn't expect to help you, but they help you a lot, that then also your empathy towards that person changes. We see the same effects on the behavior level that we see on the neural level here. So ratings of these people actually went up afterwards. So there's a clear effect of positive social interactions with people that are outside of our group that changes empathic responses at the behavioral and at the neural level, which is basically good news, right? So we can learn to change our expectations, and we can learn to empathize with people from outgroups if we have these kinds of positive experiences with them. The important point here is that empathy is not set in stone, but it's context dependent, and it can be trained. And that's something I'd like to leave you with for this lecture. So let me summarize everything. We've talked about brain networks now that are involved in social choice. We have a reward network that's involved in social rewards. Just think back of the Izuma study, when people are getting feedback about their personality, that clearly drives the reward system. We have a social cognition network that's involved in possibly modulating or interacting with this reward system under different social contexts by understanding the intentions of others. Are they positive intentions towards us? Are there negative intentions? And then this can allow us to modulate the reward-related responses here. They consist of temporoparietal junction and dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. And then finally, we have these social emotion and empathy-related neural networks that include the anterior insula, which we have seen in a number of studies now is clearly involved in processing empathy towards another person. It's also part of the pain matrix, which is quite interesting. So there's this mirror neuron link here with also social emotions, not just with understanding other people's actions, but also understanding other people's emotions and how bad certain situations might be for them, given how we might feel in these types of situations ourselves. So these are the three brain networks that are involved in social choice and that are commonly activated in the context of social neuroeconomics.